They called it the Pacific, but for Japan it may as well have been a minefield laid by ghosts. Ships exploded without warning. Convoys vanished overnight. Radio operators heard nothing. Lookouts saw nothing. And admirals, men who once believed they ruled the oceans, stared at maps wondering how an enemy they couldn't see was dismantling their empire piece by piece. The Imperial Japanese Navy prided itself on being the apex predator of the Pacific, but predators don't survive when they can't detect what's hunting them. What Japan never understood, until it was far too late, is that the United States had created a new kind of navy. Not a fleet of battleships or carriers, not steel giants with towering guns, but a silent armada of submarines armed with torpedoes that stalked from the depths like underwater executioners. These submarines did not seek glory. They sought targets. And every time Japan believed the ocean was safe, the ghost fleet struck again. Before we go any deeper into this silent war beneath the waves, I want to know something from you. From where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop your city, state, or country down in the comments. I'm always blown away by how far these stories travel. And while you're there, tell me if you ever imagined that Japan wasn't defeated by the fire of battleships or the thunder of aircraft carriers, but by submarines they couldn't even detect. Also, smash that like button if this is already blowing your mind. It tells YouTube that you're part of the crew that wants the truth, not the watered-down version served in history class. And if you haven't subscribed yet, seriously, what are you waiting for? We're just getting started. There are battles, weapons, and secrets coming up that most people have never heard before. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next mission. Now, buckle up, because the ocean is about to go dark, and the ghosts are about to hunt. The war in the Pacific did not begin with explosions. It began with assumptions, deadly ones. Japan believed that naval supremacy was earned with massive battleships, towering pagoda masts, and torpedoes so advanced that no enemy could match them. To Tokyo, American industry was clumsy, American sailors inexperienced, and American leadership too slow to adapt. They saw the United States as a nation of factories, not a nation of predators. What they never expected was that the deadliest predators are the ones you can't see. As Japan celebrated early victories across Asia, engineers and strategists at the US Navy were quietly reshaping the battlefield. They understood something Japan had ignored. Surface fleets are powerful, but they are visible. Carriers cast shadows. Battleships shake the earth when they fire. Cruisers announce themselves long before their guns speak. But submarines don't exist until they choose to. The United States had fewer submarines than Japan at the start of the war, but every one of them was a machine built for patience, silence, and lethality. Fleet boats like the Gato class, stretched 311 feet long, carried 24 torpedoes, and could dive to depths beyond 300 feet, deeper than Japanese sonar could reliably track. Their diesel-electric propulsion gave them a top surface speed of 21 knots and allowed them to run nearly silent underwater. They weren't impressive to look at. They didn't have massive guns. They didn't tower above the waves. But what they had was something Japan never accounted for: invisibility. Submariners trained in complete sensory isolation. No sunlight, no fresh air, no windows, just steel, sweat, and pressure. Yet these were not ordinary sailors. They were hunters who memorized shipping routes, studied tides, and learned to strike at moments when other branches of the military were asleep. While battles raged above, the true war, the war that would starve Japan, was happening in darkness. Early missions revealed two brutal truths. First, American submarine crews were fearless. Second, their torpedoes were traitors. The Mark 14, the primary submarine weapon, was plagued with failures. It detonated prematurely. It ran too deep. It curved off course. Worse, it often slammed into enemy hulls without exploding. Commanders filed furious complaints, but Washington insisted the weapon was flawless. After all, it had been tested. On paper, it was perfect. In the real world, it was a curse. Imagine stalking an enemy convoy for 36 hours, lining up the perfect shot, firing 3 torpedoes, and watching them bounce off steel like rubber baseballs. It was enough to drive sane men to rage. Yet the crews endured. Every failure was a lesson. Every malfunction was recorded. Every dud was fuel for an anger that would eventually ignite a revolution in American naval warfare. Because here's the hidden truth. Japan was not defeated by superior numbers. Japan was defeated by superior adaptation. While Japanese admirals celebrated past victories, American submariners were inventing the future. They rewired firing pins at sea. They measured depth settings using improvised tools. They risked court-martial to modify weapons they knew were broken. And when the Mark 14 finally worked as intended, the Pacific became something else entirely. A hunting ground. The Ghost Fleet was awakening. By mid-1942, something unnerving began to happen. Japanese ships were disappearing, not during epic surface engagements, not under waves of aircraft, but quietly, without witnesses, like stones dropped into a bottomless well. Convoy commanders reported explosions without periscopes. Destroyer captains chased phantom contacts. Entire squadrons sailed through supposedly safe waters only to never arrive at their destinations. The Imperial Japanese Navy, for the first time in its history, faced an enemy it could not see, track, or understand. American submarines weren't just attacking, they were erasing. Each patrol became a chess match played underwater, and the US Navy had begun to master moves Japan didn't even know existed. Submarine captains understood the psychology of their prey. They studied Japanese escort tactics, recognized patterns of fear, and exploited the one weakness Japan never thought it had: predictability. Japanese ships traveled in straight lines. They relied on outdated sonar that couldn't track targets below 300 feet. Their depth charges detonated at shallow depths, wasting explosive potential. Every flaw was an opportunity. Meanwhile, US submarines evolved into underwater snipers. Their sonar operators could differentiate between merchant vessels, destroyers, and tankers based solely on propeller rhythm. Their torpedo fire solutions calculated speed, distance, and angle within seconds. And once a submarine fired, time became the most terrifying weapon of all. The ocean went silent. Torpedoes closed in, and Japanese sailors prayed, not for victory, but for sight of an enemy that refused to materialize. Japan's command structure collapsed under confusion. Reports contradicted each other. Captains blamed sea monsters, mines, even sabotage. Some believed the US possessed invisible ships. Others assumed American submarines were blessed by unnatural luck. Admirals refused to accept what was happening. They were losing a war to math, patience, and steel tubes the size of city buses. American submarines weren't safe, of course. The Pacific was a hellscape of pressure and death. A single depth charge, 300 pounds of TNT detonated underwater, could rip a submarine in half. Pressure at 400 feet crushed hulls like paper. Every dive was a gamble with physics, fate, and oxygen. Yet the crews persisted. They knew they weren't fighting for territory or glory. They were fighting to cut Japan's throat without ever drawing a sword. And then the numbers turned brutal. Oil shipments plummeted. Aircraft carriers couldn't train pilots. Battleships sat idle, their engines thirsty for fuel that no longer existed. Japanese civilians starved while submarines hunted convoys of rice and fertilizer. The Pacific economy bled out slowly, invisibly, one torpedo at a time. What Japan failed to grasp was that a navy doesn't die when its ships sink. A navy dies when it can no longer move. America understood this. Japan did not. While Tokyo dreamed of decisive battles, the United States executed annihilation through starvation, isolation, and pressure. The ocean had become a weapon, and American submarines were its venom glands. Soon, the Japanese Empire wouldn't just fear the Ghost Fleet, they would fear silence. Because silence meant death. The silence didn't just kill Japanese ships, it corrupted their confidence. Officers who once boasted about naval honor now whispered superstitions. Some refused night patrols, others claimed they could hear American submarines breathing beneath the waves. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Pacific, was being psychologically dismantled by enemies they couldn't shoot, track, or predict. And the worst part? They still didn't understand how it was happening. The US. Ghost Fleet wasn't supernatural. It was engineered. Every submarine was a factory of destruction, combining stealth with mathematical precision. A Balao-class submarine carried torpedoes nearly 21 feet long, each weighing 3,000 pounds, enough explosive force to snap a cruiser in half. Its diesel-electric engines allowed silent approaches, where the only thing Japan heard before dying was the metallic echo of a detonator striking steel. But weapons weren't the only advantage. Doctrine was. American submarine captains were trained differently. They were encouraged to think, innovate, and push beyond the rulebook. While Japanese officers followed rigid scripts, U.S. commanders treated war like a puzzle. They exploited weather fronts to mask periscope shadows. They hunted convoys from below the thermocline, where sonar signals bent and vanished. They studied moon phases, wave reflections, and propeller harmonics. Japan fought with honor. America fought with geometry. The Pacific wasn't random chaos. It became a battlefield Americans measured, calculated, and weaponized. When a submarine fired 6 torpedoes, it wasn't hope. It was math. The command to launch wasn't emotional. It was inevitable. Still, every mission carried one haunting truth. Once detected, a submarine became prey. Japanese destroyers released depth charges by the dozen, and each explosion sent shrapnel through the ocean at supersonic speed. The pressure wave alone could rupture lungs, crack welds, or permanently warp the hull. Men inside the submarine sat in darkness, gripping steel rails as the world outside shook apart. Bolts snapped, gauges shattered, pipes screamed, and yet crews endured. They sweated in 110-degree heat, surrounded by diesel fumes, machinery noise, and recycled air that tasted like burned metal. Every depth dive was agony, every silence a prayer. They risked drowning, implosion, and fire, not for headlines or parades, but because they understood something the Japanese never did. Invisible weapons decide real wars. By late 1943, the results were irreversible. Japanese maritime losses skyrocketed. Carriers couldn't sortie. Destroyers ran out of fuel. Merchant fleets no longer reached China, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies. Combat units stranded on islands starved long before encountering U.S. Marines. Japan's empire, once expanding, now strangled itself in slow motion. Even Tokyo's admirals, men raised in the cult of naval supremacy, realized their nightmare was not battleships or bombers. It was absence. No sails on the horizon. No engines in the night. No convoys returning. A ghost doesn't frighten because it kills. A ghost frightens because you never know when it will. The U.S. submarines didn't roar like battleships. They whispered, and Japan never learned how to stop a whisper. Because whispers don't surface. Whispers don't duel. Whispers wait. And when whispers strike, they don't warn the living. They collect the dead. By 1944, Japan wasn't fighting a navy. It was fighting a statistical inevitability. Every ship that left port was already a ghost. It just didn't know the exact hour of its funeral. Convoys that once stretched across the Pacific now traveled in fragmented clusters, escorted by destroyers, burning precious fuel they no longer had. Admirals argued in Tokyo. Officers blamed fate, sabotage, spirits. Anything except the truth. They were being methodically erased by an enemy they couldn't see. The Ghost Fleet didn't need massive guns or towering turrets. It didn't rely on intimidation. Its power came from subtraction, removing Japan's ships from existence one by one, without leaving witnesses. To understand the scale, consider this. U.S. submarines accounted for only 2% of the American Navy's manpower, yet they sank 55% of all Japanese warships destroyed during the entire war. That number wasn't luck, wasn't coincidence. It was annihilation by design. The Japanese Navy had gambled on surface supremacy, towering battleships, monstrous carriers, and the romantic illusion that war would be decided by grand duels under the rising sun. But grand duels require supplies, fuel, ammo, reinforcements, and every drum of oil Japan needed came across the ocean. When the Ghost Fleet severed those arteries, the empire started bleeding internally. Without oil, planes didn't fly. Without merchant ships, armies didn't move. Without convoys, Japan didn't fight. It waited to die. As American submarines perfected their craft, they developed a terrifying rhythm. The hunt began before sunrise, when convoys were most vulnerable. Radar masts barely scraped above the waterline. Periscopes remained hidden until the last possible second. Captains calculated fire solutions, while engines idled silent. The torpedo doors opened, a sound so faint it was mistaken for current noise. And then the ocean delivered judgment. One strike, and a destroyer split. Another, and a tanker erupted into pillars of flame. Survivors screamed into radios that emitted only static. The last thing heard was a depth gauge shattering as the ship slipped beneath the waves. Japan's sonar operators began reporting phantom contacts, echoes that came and went like hallucinations. Some believed the Americans had invented invisible submarines. Others thought the ocean itself had betrayed them. They weren't entirely wrong. The water had become a weapon. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical. Japanese sailors stopped sleeping. Commanders avoided certain routes altogether. Even when no American submarine was present, the fear of one forced Japan to behave as if it were surrounded. And that was the genius. A weapon doesn't have to fire to win. It only has to force the enemy to act differently. The US Ghost Fleet didn't dominate the Pacific by engaging every target. It dominated by deciding which targets would never reach their destination. It didn't chase glory, it chased inevitability. Japan still had admirals, still had islands, still had flags. What it no longer had was time. As the noose tightened, the Empire realized something horrifying. They weren't losing battles, they were losing the ocean. And once an island nation loses the ocean, it loses the war, even before it knows it. The Japanese Navy had always believed that honor lived on the surface, in battleships with towering pagoda masts, in carrier decks filled with Zero fighters, in the thunderous spectacle of naval guns echoing across the Pacific. What they never understood was that the future of warfare wasn't loud, it wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't heroic in the way their ancestors imagined. It was invisible, mathematical, and merciless. While Japan prepared fleets for decisive engagements, the United States prepared something else entirely. An armada that didn't want to be seen, didn't want medals, and didn't need witnesses. The Ghost Fleet perfected a doctrine no Japanese admiral ever predicted: war without warning. And nothing illustrated this more brutally than the fate of the convoys moving from the Dutch East Indies. These ships carried the one resource Japan couldn't fight without: oil. Every tanker was a floating bloodstream vessel feeding aircraft, tanks, destroyers, and carriers. Without it, the Pacific Empire was nothing but rusting steel and ceremonial uniforms. So the US submarines began cutting veins, one strike at a time. The USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, became a legend not because it was the biggest submarine, but because it was silent, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. In just 5 patrols, it sank an entire nation's worth of logistics. On one mission alone, Tang shredded a convoy that Tokyo had declared unsinkable. Ships didn't explode, they vanished, as if the ocean itself had swallowed the Empire's dreams. Then came USS Harder, the submarine that sank destroyers. Harder didn't just sink escort ships, it humiliated them. In a single breathtaking series of engagements, it sent multiple Japanese destroyers to the bottom, forcing the Imperial Navy to divert warships designed for fleet battles into convoy escort duty. Harder wasn't killing ships, it was killing strategy. The Ghost Fleet wasn't content with destroying hardware, it dismantled Japan's operating system. Every merchantman sunk forced aircraft to remain grounded. Every tanker lost forced destroyers to sit idle. Every missing supply ship forced soldiers to starve before they ever saw an American rifle. This wasn't pressure, it was suffocation. Yet what most people don't realize is that the Ghost Fleet fought in conditions no surface sailor would tolerate. Submariners inhaled recycled air, infused with exhaust fumes. Temperatures routinely reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the engine rooms. Men slept next to live torpedoes, each containing warheads packed with hundreds of pounds of Torpex explosive, powerful enough to vaporize the entire compartment in an instant. One wrong valve, one missed weld, one lucky depth charge. Death wasn't a possibility. It was a roommate. These men didn't fight for glory. Their battles didn't have cheering crowds, waving flags, or triumphant marches. Their victories happened in silence, thousands of miles from home, marked only by bubbles rising to the surface. They fought in darkness so Americans could live in light. They destroyed an empire few even understood. By mid-1944, Japan wasn't losing the Pacific. It was running out of ocean to hide in. The Ghost Fleet didn't just defeat Japan's navy, it amputated its future, one convoy at a time, until the rising sun became a shadow cast on waters it no longer controlled. And the world had no idea. Not yet, because the dead don't speak. But the ocean remembers. As 1945 approached, something unprecedented occurred. Japan still possessed aircraft, fortresses, and soldiers ready to die for the emperor. But they couldn't move them. They were frozen in place like statues on collapsing islands, waiting for a battle that would never come. Their greatest enemy wasn't an invasion fleet. It wasn't bombers from Saipan. It wasn't even the atomic age emerging on the horizon. Their deadliest adversary was silence. The Ghost Fleet had transformed the Pacific from an ocean into a trap. Any attempt at movement, even a single freighter, risked annihilation. US submarines had refined their hunting methods to a science. They no longer searched for targets. They intercepted them like predators following blood in the water. And nothing illustrated this shift more powerfully than the weapon Japan had foolishly dismissed, the American torpedo. Once ridiculed for failing to detonate, running too deep, or circling back toward its own submarines, the Mark 14 torpedo became Japan's most persistent nightmare after its flaws were fixed. Its warhead carried 643 pounds of torpex, an explosive 50% more powerful than TNT, and when it struck a hull, it didn't just blow a hole. It erased history. Ships didn't sink gracefully. They tore apart, steel bent like fabric, boilers ruptured, fuel ignited into infernos that could be seen for miles. Survivors didn't pray for rescue, they prayed for a quick death. Japanese commanders couldn't comprehend how the Americans had evolved so fast. They still believed in decisive surface engagements, Jutland-style duels fought by battleships and honor. But honor doesn't matter when your ship never arrives to fight. The Ghost Fleet sidestepped Japan's cultural backbone and targeted its arteries. This wasn't war by confrontation, it was war by disappearance. Merchant captains begged for air cover. Fuel depots rationed supplies. Destroyers designed to escort fleets were now babysitting convoys, like terrified parents walking children through a burning city. And the Americans knew something else. A navy that protects its merchants dies slower than a navy that loses them. Japan chose the second fate. Convoys shrank until they became pathetic shadows. 4 ships guarded by 2 destroyers, zigzagging like prey in a shark tank. Some commanders sailed without lights, believing darkness kept them safe. They didn't realize it made them easier to track against phosphorescent waters. Others shut down radios entirely, convinced silence meant invisibility. The Ghost Fleet smiled. You cannot hide from an enemy who doesn't need to see you to kill you. Even when Japan tried to adapt, deploying aircraft patrols, installing sonar, creating complex escort routes, it was too late. The Americans were already 2 steps ahead, reading tide charts, decoding convoy schedules, and positioning submarines like chess pieces arranged around checkmate. Japan had begun the war believing it could cripple American will. Instead, America crippled Japan's ability to exist. The empire was no longer defending territory. It was defending the illusion of control. Every torpedo launched was another thread severed. Every ship lost was a limb amputated. Every unescorted tanker was a countdown. Japan wasn't fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting to breathe, and the ocean was holding its throat. Japan didn't lose the Pacific in a climactic naval showdown. It didn't lose because of the firepower of American battleships or because of aircraft carriers launching wave after wave of Hellcats and Avengers. Japan lost because the United States built a navy that didn't need witnesses, a navy that erased its enemies before history even had time to record their names. By early 1945, the Ghost Fleet had become something far more terrifying than a military force. It was a pattern, a natural law, a certainty. Japanese sailors stepped aboard ships, knowing their odds of surviving the next patrol were barely higher than a coin flip. Some convoys sailed with priests on board, as if the ocean had become a graveyard that demanded offerings. The Pacific was shrinking, not physically, but strategically. Entire zones of water that had once been highways for Japanese logistics were now death corridors. Maps in Japanese command rooms became scar tissue, red X's marking convoys that never returned, supply ships that vanished, tankers turned into underwater tombs. The United States had accomplished something no admiral in history had achieved. They weaponized absence. The Ghost Fleet didn't need to patrol every mile of ocean. It only needed to convince Japan that submarines were everywhere. And once that belief took hold, Japan began fighting shadows. Destroyers burned fuel they couldn't replace while chasing phantom periscopes. Aircraft patrolled empty seas looking for enemies that weren't there. Convoys rerouted thousands of miles around imaginary threats and still died. The ocean wasn't contested, it was owned. This ownership became undeniable when entire islands, once fortified jewels of the Japanese Empire, became prisons. The Imperial Army wasn't defeated in glorious combat. It was starved, isolated, consumed by silence. No reinforcements, no fuel, no resupply. Soldiers waited for help that never came because help had been sunk before leaving port. The American submariners understood something deeper than tactics. A nation can recover from lost ships. It cannot recover from losing the ability to move. And that's exactly what happened. Without oil, Japan's aircraft sat grounded. Without supplies, its tanks rusted. Without ships, its soldiers became stranded monuments to a dying empire. The rising sun still flew, but its shadow no longer reached beyond the horizon. Then came the moment that told the world everything they needed to know. Japan's once proud battleships, symbols of imperial might, were ordered to remain in harbor, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they couldn't fuel up. A navy built for decisive battles died without ever firing its guns. It wasn't torpedoes that ended Japan's dreams. It was the realization that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see, never hear, and never even confirm exists until it's too late. The Ghost Fleet didn't destroy Japan's navy with explosions. It destroyed it with inevitability. And when the Empire finally gazed across the Pacific and saw not enemy sails, not bombers, not fleets, but a horizon filled with nothing, that was the moment Japan understood. The United States didn't just conquer the ocean, it removed it from Japan's possession. The Pacific belonged to America now. By the final months of the war, Japan wasn't defending an empire, it was clinging to the memory of one. The Ghost Fleet had done more than sink ships. It had shattered the strategic backbone of a nation that once believed it was destined to rule the Pacific. The Imperial Navy, once a force that terrified Western intelligence, now existed mostly on paper, reduced to silhouettes of vessels that could not sail, could not fight, and could not escape. American submariners, meanwhile, continued their work with a precision that bordered on ritual. Patrols launched from Fremantle, Pearl Harbor, and Midway became conveyor belts of destruction. Crews rotated out, submarines refueled, torpedoes reloaded, and then they vanished again beneath the waves, slipping through the Pacific like scalpels, slicing into the arteries of Japan's war machine. And the Japanese knew it. They didn't fear the fleet they could see, they feared the fleet they could not. What made the Ghost Fleet unmatched wasn't just engineering or tactics. It was commitment. These submariners lived in steel coffins, ate canned food next to live torpedoes, and breathed air so thick with diesel that their uniforms smelled like the engine room for weeks after deployment. They endured humidity, heat, and confinement that would break ordinary men, let alone warriors expected to remain silent while depth charges detonated around them like underwater earthquakes. Yet they kept going, because they understood that victory wasn't measured in battles won, it was measured in resources denied. Every ton of oil lost meant one fewer Zero fighter in the sky. Every merchant ship destroyed meant another island garrison cut off. Every tanker sunk meant another Japanese naval operation cancelled before it began. When historians later examined Japan's collapse, they didn't find a moment of defeat. They found a slope, steep, irreversible, and carved by submarines. And still the Ghost Fleet evolved. Radar improved, sonar techniques sharpened, attack patterns became more ruthless. Japan wasn't facing a static enemy, it was facing a predator that learned faster than it could adapt. Even when the Imperial Navy invented new escort tactics, the Americans anticipated them. New routes, tracked and ambushed. Reinforcements, intercepted and drowned. Secret cargo, found and erased. The submarine commanders didn't just know the Pacific, they understood its psychology. Waves distorted sonar, moonlight painted silhouettes, thermal layers hid propeller signatures. To them, the ocean wasn't a battlefield, it was a map, a living blueprint, a grid where death could be placed wherever it was needed. By mid-1945, the Japanese merchant fleet, once 6 million tons strong, was reduced to rubble. Convoys stopped entirely. Oil production plummeted. Steel factories shut down. Air bases became museums of grounded aircraft that would never fly again. Japan's admirals had spent decades dreaming of Tsushima-style surface victories, grand duels where honor decided the fate of nations. Instead, they were defeated by men who never saw their enemies' faces and never expected applause. The empire didn't end with a roar. It ended with a shortage, no fuel, no food, no movement, no hope. And still, the world remained largely unaware of the Ghost Fleet's role. Newspapers printed photos of aircraft carriers and battleships. Hollywood celebrated pilots and Marines storming beaches. But beneath the surface, in the quiet darkness of the Pacific, another war had been fought. A war of patience, mathematics, and silence. A war Japan never understood. A war Japan never saw. A war Japan never had a chance to win. The Pacific War did not end with Japan outgunned. It ended with Japan outthought. When American submariners finally tallied the destruction they had wrought, the numbers bordered on the unbelievable. The Ghost Fleet, just a few hundred submarines and a few thousand men, had sunk nearly 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, annihilated critical supply routes, and severed the arteries that fed an entire empire. And they did it without parades, without headlines, without fanfare. While the world focused on battles like Leyte Gulf, Midway, and Iwo Jima, something far more decisive unfolded below the surface. Japan wasn't defeated by a clash of titans. It was defeated by thousands of moments where American submariners made decisions no spreadsheet could predict and no admiral could counter. Every torpedo fired wasn't just a weapon. It was a sentence, a death warrant for a vessel that, once struck, would never contribute to Japan's war effort again. The Ghost Fleet didn't just hunt ships, it hunted time. It robbed Japan of the days, months, and years required to sustain a war it could no longer afford. That's the part most people never understand. Wars aren't won by who has more guns. Wars are won by who can still move them. While the rising sun still shone on Japanese uniforms, the empire beneath it had already collapsed. Cities waited for supplies that never came. Airfields became tombs for aircraft that would never take off. Soldiers waited for orders they could no longer execute. Admirals shouted commands into radios that connected to nothing. A nation built on motion was dying in place. This wasn't coincidence, it was design. American submarines didn't operate as lone wolves. They operated as a neural network stretched across the ocean. Boats like the USS Barb, USS Harder, USS Tang, and USS Wahoo became legends whispered in Tokyo war rooms. These names didn't inspire respect. They inspired dread. Even the successes Japan achieved came wrapped in tragedy. When Japan finally learned how to hunt submarines more effectively, it was too late. The ocean was already contaminated with ghosts. The few victories they achieved, depth charges detonated, lucky kills, did nothing to reverse the starvation, the fuel shortages, the grounded aircraft, or the immobile fleets rusting in their own harbors. The Ghost Fleet had accomplished something no superweapon ever could. It rewrote the strategic laws of the Pacific. It didn't win by overpowering Japan's strengths. It won by annihilating the very foundation those strengths depended on. That's why historians who truly understand this war don't point to Midway as the moment Japan lost. They point to something far less cinematic. Merchant ships that never arrived, convoys that never completed their voyages, resources that vanished into the deep. The war ended long before the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Japan just didn't know it yet, because the dead don't realize they're dead until someone tells them. And on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan finally signed the documents ending the war, they weren't surrendering to the battleships looming overhead. They were surrendering to ghosts, to men who fought where sunlight never reached, men who mastered silence, men who weaponized patience, men who turned the Pacific into America's dominion without ever raising their voices. A war fought in shadows had ended in daylight, but the shadows were the reason daylight returned. The Pacific didn't fall because America had bigger guns or louder engines. It fell because a silent brotherhood of men accepted a kind of warfare that no nation was prepared to counter. They fought without the roar of crowds, without the flash of cameras, without knowing if anyone would ever understand what they had done. Yet their fingerprints are etched across history. These submariners lived in steel tubes, barely 300 feet long, dove into oceans blacker than night, and carried torpedoes capable of reshaping empires. They hunted in silence so the world could speak freely. They endured heat, fear, and darkness so others could live in peace. And while their battles left no grand monuments, their victories redefined the Pacific. Japan didn't lose territory. It lost the ability to move. That is the signature of the Ghost Fleet. So today, we honor the crews of boats like the USS Tang, USS Harder, USS Wahoo, USS Barb, and so many others whose names are carved in the quiet corners of history. We honor the torpedoes that roared without warning, the sonar pings that marked fate, and the ocean that became America's greatest weapon. Because freedom wasn't won by noise. It was won by shadows, by men who turned silence into victory, by ghosts who never missed.